It's an evolution party and you're invited. If you have evidence for evolution, join the stream at the link that's in the chat and please come and share your evidence for evolution. If nobody joins, I'm just going to do a little evolution bashing. And so I'm here to celebrate that evolution is not true and that the truth is there is a creator of all things. And that is a scientific belief based on our scientific observations about the complexity of life. I believe evolution is actually anti-scientific. It goes against our scientific observations. And I'll give you one of those in a minute. But first, I want to talk about last week, because last week Jackson Rowe joined and he shared what he believed was some evidence for evolution. I'm going to go over a little bit of that and what I found with regard to that. So let's see. Jackson brought up ostracoderms. I'm not sure how to pronounce that. As, oh, good. Jackson's here in the chat. Good to see you. Okay. So he brought this up as an example of a fish and a fish predecessor. And, you know, I looked this up and to me, this is a fish and it's a little bit maybe of a different type of fish than a bony fish, but that there's nothing about this that tells me that this is a fish predecessor. They may have some features in common with a bony fish and then other features that are not in common, but that doesn't tell me anything about the history. And we already have Howard joining. I'm so glad Howard's here. Hey, Howard, good to see you. Thank you for joining. I'm glad you're here. If it's okay, I just want to finish telling what Jackson shared and show where we're at on our list, at least with regard to the fossil record. Is that okay?
Yeah, for some reason there's a bit of a delay, so I'm going to exit and come back in.
Okay, sure. Thanks. Okay, so I do not include this as a list on the list of oh, Jackson's here. Oh, good. Okay. Hey, Jackson. I'm glad you're here. So you can defend your position if you want. Did you want to say something about this right now?
Well, I mean, just continue. I didn't really catch much. I was going backstage, so I didn't really hear.
Well, I said I don't accept this as a fish predecessor because even though it might like share some features that bony fish have, but for me, that doesn't qualify as like showing that it's a predecessor. And
sorry, go ahead.
So I was going to move on to the next thing real quick. You brought up no bony fish in the Cambrian. I looked that up. That I found is true, and I added it to my list of things that favor evolution, fossil evidence that favor evolution. Now, so here's our running list of fossil evidence that favors evolution, and the red is problematic things in the fossils for evolution. And so that's where we're at with that. All the things I brought up last week are on the list of problems for evolution. You challenged the idea of all forms arising in the Cambrian. And yes, I misspoke on that actually. So you mentioned that these things were found in the Ediacaran. And so I, put those here. And I didn't really have to change anything on my slide because I didn't actually say all on my slide. I said the sudden appearance of, forms in the Cambrian, which is still the problem. So you challenged the idea of the coelacanth being missing, but I did look and I found it was in fact missing in the fossil record for 66 million years. So I think that's everything that I found. So you guys can feel free to share with me. And I am going to have to kind of, that doesn't look good. There we go. I have to kind of change my format, I realized, because you presented so much stuff last week that it takes me a while to chase it down. So I'm going to ask you to give me specific, but like one thing that you think is evidence for evolution. If
Okay.
that's okay, I can tackle one at a time. Otherwise, it just gets out of control. So let's let Howard share because he jumped on here first. And so,
Okay.
and
Well,
just for the audience to know, I want the audience to know that Howard has a PhD in paleontology and has worked in the in like oil and geology for 26 years. So he has a lot of knowledge about geology. And so I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say, Howard. Go for it.
So two things. First, about the coelacanth. The coelacanth is the only animal ever to have been found as a fossil, thought to have been extinct, and then found alive. No other animal, and there's also one plant species that happened for. So it's not like there's a lot of animals or plants that are thought to be extinct and then later found alive with some big gap. It's the only animals, fossils that have big gaps are the ones that are very difficult to preserve, where they're just, say, entirely soft-bodied and you only rarely get a glimpse of the fossil record. But what I really wanted to talk about today is the late Paleozoic, the Permian and Pennsylvanian, and Jackson, you got on this a little bit last time. So if you look at the land animals, and I've actually worked on this, I've done excavations in the late Paleozoic, there's wonderful preservation of diverse ecosystems in the late Paleozoic. They're worldwide. We see them all over. And they're dominated, the land animals are dominated, at least the large ones are dominated by therapsids, which includes the pelycosaurs. So the pelycosaurs, if you Google it if you don't know what they are, but they're the finback reptiles. They are not dinosaurs. It's not even clear they're reptiles because they're anapsids, which were anapsids. And all the other reptiles like crocodiles, dinosaurs, ichthyosaurs, those are all synapsids. And so it's not even correct to call them reptiles. But what's really interesting is there are a few modern-looking animals that you find with this group. You find cockroaches and you find dragonflies. And if you look at a fossil of a dragonfly from this time, it's immediately recognizable. There's no question that's what it is. And there's these giant millipedes that are maybe 100 pounds heavy, maybe 6-7 feet long. These really giant land arthropods. But if you look at the land vertebrates, there's not a single land vertebrate that is modern. No mammals, no birds, no bats, nothing. And all the therapsids are extinct. Nobody's ever found a therapsid living today. And there's no dinosaurs. And so from a creationist perspective, how does that happen? How do you get an ecosystem that is so completely isolated from everything living today and everything that lived subsequently? No crocodiles, no dinosaurs of any kind, no ichthyosaurs, no pterosaurs, none of that, and no mammals at all. Not only that, but the plants are different. So there are some plants that are the same. There are conifers back then. The other trees are lycopsids and sphenopsids, which are alive today, but they're very diminutive. They don't form big trees. Another group of trees called the pteridosperms or the seed ferns are completely extinct today. But what's really odd from a creationist perspective, and they tend to try to ignore this, is not a speck of angiosperm, anything. No flowers, no leaves, not even a speck of pollen. And just to give you an idea of how odd that is, pollen today, angiosperm pollen today, of course, there's gymnosperm pollen, the conifer pollen back then, because there's conifers, but there's no angiosperm pollen, which is distinct. Angiosperm pollen today is everywhere. Any place in the world where you find mud being deposited, you find angiosperm pollen being deposited. It blows across the ocean from continent to continent. It's in every environment. Pollen is virtually indestructible. I mean, it really is difficult to get rid of, even in an oxygenated water column. And it's super common today. If you grab a handful of mud, it's going to have angiosperm pollen in it. But not a speck of angiosperm pollen in the entire Paleozoic. Not one speck. There's a couple reports, but they're unverified. No one's been able to reproduce it, verify it by collecting specimens and finding it. And since it's so common, it's just so easy to contaminate specimens. But when you look at rocks from, say, the Cretaceous and later, especially in the Paleogene, they're filled with angiosperm pollen. You can't get away from it. So this complete separation of modern ecosystems from the late Paleozoic, I think, is impossible to explain with any kind of an ecosystem boundary for the late Paleozoic. No mammals of any kind. So, I'm just curious how and lots and lots of plant fossils, lots and lots of animal fossils. So it's not a preservational bias. There's tons and tons of bones, but no modern animals no modern vertebrates. I shouldn't say animals. I should say vertebrates. No modern vertebrates of any kind, and all the vertebrates that we find then, terrestrial vertebrates, are gone today. So how could you explain that?
Well, first I want to ask two questions about that. So you said all the modern vertebrates. Are you saying it was only pelycosaurs, or what are you saying? Or are you saying there was other animals that are now extinct that are also there?
Well, I want to be specific and say vertebrates. There's certainly animals that were alive then that are alive now, like cockroaches and dragonflies. Those are animals, right? But for land vertebrates, there's not a single land vertebrate from the late Paleozoic that is alive today. And excuse me, and there is not a single land vertebrate from today or from any time in the Cretaceous or Jurassic that is found in the late Paleozoic. Do you agree, Jackson, that that's a reasonable statement?
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
Well, my next question is, how many places have we exposed that Permian layer? Like, how many digs would
Thousands.
you say?
Thousands.
A lot. I found like 5 or 6 in Arkansas alone, fossil sites of Carboniferous alone.
Okay,
Yeah.
so then that leads me to the next question. How do you know that's the layer that you're in? Like, when you find a fossil, how do you know that that's the Carboniferous layer? That's the
Biostratigraphy.
Okay, so wait a minute. That sounds like the classic dating the rocks by the fossils and the fossils by the rocks. So if you find that animal in that layer, you say that layer has to be the Permian.
No.
Okay.
Biostratigraphy, creationists universally get biostratigraphy wrong. Every creationist I've heard describe biostratigraphy gets it wrong how it actually works. So this is how it actually works. The succession of fossils that we find worldwide is the same with local variations. I mean, like Tyrannosaurus rex only occurs in the Western North America and nowhere else. But there are, you mentioned this last week, that there are a succession of land vertebrates that are always in the same order. It's pelycosaurs, then dinosaurs, and then all the mammals that we find today that don't occur with dinosaurs. So it's bears, dogs, cats, ungulates. And so that order is the same worldwide. There is no exception. It's always the same. And this is just very gross, but you could do this at a much finer scale with other fossils. So that's the basis of biostratigraphy, is that the order is always the same for the animals that are widely distributed. In some plants, the algae is used as well. The way biostratigraphy actually works is for every boundary, there is a type location. That is, by definition, the location for that boundary. So it used to be that there would be a type section. So the Devonian was named for rocks that are exposed in Devon, England. The Cretaceous is named for rocks that are outside in the Paris Basin, and Mississippian for rocks that are exposed along the Mississippi River. The way it works today is, and there's actually an app that you have that can download. It tells you the exact latitude and longitude and the bedding surface that defines that boundary. So say the base of the Permian is defined by a surface in one location. That's where the definition is. And then you extrapolate that using biostratigraphy. So people choose these locations based on fossiliferous successions, especially marine fossils. And then they look at the succession of animal fossils and sometimes plant fossils in that succession. And then they correlate it laterally based on the fossils, not based on lithology, based on the fossils. So when creationists say you're dating the rocks by the fossils and the fossils by the rocks, they're lying. I'm sorry, they're lying, because the fossils that we use to date the rocks are different than the fossils that are dated by the rocks they're in. Now, you can, to a certain extent, piggyback on that. So once you've established that the rhapsids are mostly in the late Paleozoic, they get a little bit into the Triassic, I think. Like in South Africa, there's a succession of therapsids. And so then we already know that they're in this age, and so they can get more detail by looking at, in non-marine successions especially, looking at the types of vertebrates, the skulls that you get. But there is no circularity in biostratigraphy. Creationists say there is, and that comes from a profound lack of understanding of how biostratigraphy works. And this is something I've used in my job. I mean, I've used it extensively. And so it is not circular. It isn't. I mean, I know creationists like to say it is. It is not circular.
Yeah, I know the oil industry. Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I want to hear what you have to say.
I know the oil industry uses biostratigraphy quite a bit.
Yeah, in fact, we use it more than anywhere else. There are whole consulting companies, maybe 6 worldwide, that do nothing but do biostratigraphy for oil companies. And so it's used extensively. Almost every exploration well I was involved with, in fact, probably every exploration well, a lot of the production wells, we ran biostratigraphy, and it's expensive. You know, we might spend, I don't know, $100,000 running biostrat. And oil companies don't just waste money with circular reasoning. In fact, you know, if somebody gets found out for using circular reasoning, they're castigated. You don't get away with that. So, you know, the utility is high. And so biostratigraphy is used by the oil companies extensively. Not that that's evidence is true, but I think having been involved in that directly, we wouldn't be using it if it didn't work. And it does work.
Right. But my question about that is it working because evolution is true, or is it just that there happens to be predictable layers of sediments, and that has more to do with how animals were distributed across the world when there was a worldwide flood?
Well, you asked specifically how we know the beds are Permian or late Paleozoic, right. And so I'm answering that question. Okay. So but then you're going to a separate question. But I would ask you then, what type of ecological system would have therapsids, pelycosaurs, cockroaches, conifers, pteridosperms, dragonflies, no angiosperms, no mammals of any kind? What kind of environment would that be? And we see this worldwide. It's not a geographical distribution, it's a stratigraphic distribution. Anywhere where we get terrestrial fossils in the Permian, you find these types of animals. Never a mammal, not even a mammal footprint, not a single tooth, not a speck of angiosperm pollen. And how does that happen? Because angiosperm pollen just blows with the wind, it's everywhere. So there's just no mechanism that you could get to make this work.
Okay, well, I mean, it is an interesting issue, and I already did put your pelycosaur issue on my list. Okay, so it is interesting. And right now, the only thing I can say is that possibly there's a lot of land left to discover. So, I mean, you said we've done this thousands, we've dug in thousands of places and found this same thing. So
this is consistent, but you know, what's really tough is the angiosperm pollen. You could add that to your list. You know, the entire Paleozoic is missing angiosperm pollen, and that gets everywhere. The wind just blows it everywhere. It's just not, I think there is no creationist scenario that would allow this to work.
What about in, like, I mean, because I would say some layers there is not pollen, maybe because it's underwater.
No, that doesn't work either. I've worked on modern cores that are in 2 kilometers of water in the Black Sea. They're filled with plant debris.
Okay, well, now for you, Howard, is that good evidence that evolution is true, that things evolved from a common ancestor to produce the diversity of life?
It's part of the evidence because the succession of fossils is consistent worldwide, and it doesn't fit the ecological zonation that creationists claim it fits. One of the arguments that you hear from creationists is that as you go up through the layers, you find marine at the bottom, and then increasing amounts of terrestrial fossils, and then finally all terrestrial fossils at the top. And that's not true. That's false. That is shown to be false in many locations. And creationists, I've heard in many videos say that every formation that has terrestrial fossils from the ancient has a mix of marine and terrestrial fossils, and that's also false. What's really interesting is that when you look in, so I worked in Kansas extensively, and in Kansas, the big terrestrial fossils are 100% confined to these incisions that we interpreted as river valleys. And so you can't use this, I think, to prove succession, but prove evolutionary succession. But what you can prove is you need a lot of time. You can't do it quickly. No way can you do it in a year. All right, I'll stop talking.
I got something to add to what he said about aquatic things not being all found at the bottom. Like I've heard people say, clam fossils, oyster fossils, they're all always at the bottom. Well, I find in Arkansas, there's an Eocene layer with these. It's a 4-foot thick solid layer of nothing but these for like a mile. And the Eocene is well above the Cretaceous. So that the top of the strata is filled with, clams and oysters. So,
and there are other units that are almost exclusively terrestrial. So I'll jump to the Jurassic, which has the Morrison Formation, which I've also worked on. I'm trying to just talk about things where I have personal experience working them rather than just telling you about things I've read. So in the Morrison Formation, which outcrops extensively in central and eastern Utah and western Colorado, it is 100% non-marine. There are no marine fossils in it. There are marine fossils in the Morrison Formation in the saltwash member, which is the main member that I've worked, which is maybe 200 feet thick. But you have to go maybe 700-800 miles away, and then there's a little area with marine fossils. So when you make a paleogeographic map, you can map the area where the land was and the area where the marine fossils were, but they're not mixed. And what creationists will do is say misleading things like, the Morrison Formation has a mix of marine and terrestrial fossils, which is true, but what they're not stating is they're in different geographic areas. They're separated. And there may be a narrow zone where you find them together. But this is true of many of the formations, say, in the Cretaceous, where there's a dividing line. And on one side of the dividing line, that formation has terrestrial fossils. And on the other side of the dividing line, it's 100% marine. And there's a little bit of mixing in between, but not a lot. And so, but the Morrison Formation, 100% of the shale is paleosols, deeply weathered soils, and a couple 100 feet of soils. You can't form soils in the middle of a 1-year-long flood. It doesn't work. You need time. And that's, as a stratigrapher, that's my primary expertise is stratigraphy. The stratigraphic features we see require time. You can't do it without time. And I mean millions and millions of years.
Well, and I did want to, I can't bring an argument against that right now, but I do want to kind of go back to something you said a few weeks ago, because I brought up the challenge that why are there so many layers that don't seem to have any erosion between them? And we kind of moved on to a different topic, so I don't think we really talked about it.
Yeah,
but
I'm happy to talk about that.
Yeah, but I live in Utah, so I see tons of layers, and I see tons of layers that are just one layer, then another layer. It doesn't look like there's any erosion between them. So what am I missing here?
Where are you in Utah?
I am in the Salt Lake Valley, but I mean, travel all
Okay.
over Utah.
So there is very well documented deep incisions in do you know where the Book Cliffs are in Utah?
No,
Okay.
but I'm not very good at remembering names of
Okay.
places.
So
I'm
the
in there.
Book Cliffs is very famous for stratigraphy because it's almost 100% exposed over a distance of 150 miles or so. And it starts in, do you know where Price, Utah is? Yep. So
Yep.
you know where Highway 6 is in
Yep.
Price? Okay. So you can follow the Book Cliffs from Highway 6 down to Green River, and then it's north of I-70, and it ends just a little bit east of Grand Junction. Okay. There are dozens of incisions that are in those outcrops, but it takes some practice to see them. You have to know where to go. If you just glance at it passing on the highway, you're not going to see them, but they are very well documented. I've taken dozens of field trips. I've taken hundreds and hundreds of geologists to visit these outcrops to show them the incisions. And what's really interesting is there's a lot of them are very hard to access because they're in these sheer cliffs that are hundreds of feet tall. And I'm not going to dangle from a rope to look at them, but there are places where you can drive into the cliffs, into little reentrants, and put your finger on it. And so there's one spot that I like to go to where there's horizontal marine beds that have marine fossils in them, and they have a particular type of cross-bedding called hummocky cross-bedding, which is only associated with beaches. And so the paleogeography and the setting, the sedimentology has been well established, and they have marine fossils in them. And then there's an incision that just cuts down through it, and on the other side of the incision, the marine fossils are gone. The cross-bedding is entirely different. It's consistent with fluvial deposition. Fluvial means river, so I get caught up in the vernacular, in the vocabulary. And they only have plant fossils and no marine fossils. So the boundary of the incision is the boundary between terrestrial fossils on one side and marine fossils on the other side. The only way that can happen is well, I shouldn't say this because there's always, alternative interpretations. But the best interpretation for this outcrop and many outcrops like this is river valleys. And so river valleys are incredibly common. They're incredibly important for petroleum. And so they've been, although they were not discovered by petroleum geologists, it's really petroleum geologists that have documented them. And we use them in our business because the river sands that fill the valleys are better petroleum reservoirs than the marine sands on either side. And so there are literally thousands of documented examples of these incisions, but they don't occur everywhere. For example, in limestones, commonly limestones form when climate is dry. If the climate is dry, you don't get rivers, so you don't get valleys. Also, for the like the Entrada and the Navajo and the Wingate sandstones, which are, despite what creationists say, deposited by wind-blown sand dunes, there's no incisions there either because there's no water to form rivers, so you don't get incisions. So you don't get incisions everywhere, but they are, and common and rare are tough terms to use because what's common, what's rare. One person might describe something as rare and another person might describe the exact same evidence as indicating it's common. So what I will say is the technical term that's used is incised valley. And so I'll do a little experiment right now to see how many publications there are on this. So I'm going to go into Google Scholar, which is the best place to do this. And I'm going to type in incised valley, which is the technical term for ancient river valley. And we'll just use Cretaceous just to limit it so it's not everything. And I'll see how many. So 8,470 papers that are on incised valleys in the Cretaceous. So is that a lot or is that not a lot?
Oh yeah, that's a lot. I think.
Well, there you go. There you go.
But, I mean, I'm asking you about layers. You're giving me one example of a place that has erosion, but
I'm giving you 8,000. Do you want me to give you all 8,470 references?
No. I'm saying, but isn't that on that valley?
No. This is the Cretaceous. This is the Cretaceous worldwide.
Okay, okay.
This is 8,470 papers that have the words Incised Valley and Cretaceous. So not every paper is going to be specifically about this topic, but most will be. And so this is worldwide. And in the book Cliffs, there are probably 30 or 40 really nice valleys that are preserved in cross-section and that can be mapped out. And as a petroleum geologist, I've mapped, I don't know, 50 to 100 valleys in detail. There's even one valley system at the base of the Cretaceous where the river system has been documented that extends from South Texas all the way to northern Canada.
Sorry, I'm here. I just had to let my cat out. He was driving me crazy. Okay,
that's fine.
But I am listening. Okay.
So there's what I'm saying is there's river systems of all sizes that we find in the ancient, just like today. Of course, the bigger river systems are less common, just like big rivers today are less common than small rivers. You don't see anything in the rock record like the Grand Canyon or like mountain streams, because mountains don't get preserved like that. I mean, there's no mechanism that you could bury the Grand Canyon and have it preserved in stratigraphy. But there are lots and lots of incisions, not so much in the Grand Canyon. And creationists seem to think the Grand Canyon is all there is to stratigraphy, and it's a tiny, tiny little bit in terms of worldwide stratigraphy. And the research on this is incredible. There are many papers. I've written a few papers on incised valleys, and it's not just that the sediments that are in the incised valleys look identical to modern river sediments. It would be an amazing coincidence if there is no sedimentologic difference between the deposits of a Noachian flood and the deposits of modern day rivers. How is that possible? I mean, they're sedimentologically identical.
Well, actually, I mean, when I'm hearing you say this, and I don't know what anyone watching will say about this, but I'm hearing you say this, and to me, this does fit perfectly in line with a flood scenario, because water does move in the same types of ways, right? And so I'm hearing incised valleys, and I'm thinking of movements of water cutting through sediments. But for me, like, it doesn't matter that there's incised valleys all over. What I'm talking about, I don't think has to do with that, because when I drive around Utah, I see lots of places where there's like tons of rock layers that are supposed to be like millions of years of sedimentation, right? So they're layers that are supposed to be representing millions of years, but in between the layers, there's no sign of erosion. It looks like they were laid directly on top of one another with no, basically there's no sign that there was time in between those layers.
I'd say you're not looking correctly, because there's lots of evidence of time. One is soils, and there's lots and lots of soils in the rock record in Utah, probably thousands of them. And so that's a record of time. The incised valleys, you have to kind of know what you're looking for. This is, the reason why we take students to these outcrops is to teach them what to look for these things. But once you know what to look for, you start seeing it all over the place. Now, without knowing what specific outcrops you're talking about, I can't speak directly to them. There are marine beds that, especially marine limestones, that show no evidence of incision. So if you're looking at marine limestones, you're not going to see incisions. But there are lots of places where you see them. So it's not that it's everywhere, but it is. There are, just in the Cretaceous, 8,000 papers written on this. If I were to type just the Pennsylvanian, I'd probably get another 8,000 papers. And so there are lots of examples, but they occur in certain places. And, if you really want to know what a good analog for these systems is like, drive, I used to live in Houston, drive from Houston to Dallas. I mean, it is flat. It's been exposed for thousands of years, but it is flat. I mean, it is just flat. And every once in a while you cross a tiny little river valley. But, if you look at modern river valleys, the angle of incision is typically 1 or 2 or 3 degrees. So you're not going to see that just whizzing by an outcrop on the highway. You have to map it carefully with binoculars and spend time. And then you can see these incisions. In places, they're much steeper than that, but you have to know where to go. But there are lots and lots of examples and lots of accessible examples, and we see them in seismic. Seismic is in the petroleum industry. We use sound to produce images of the subsurface. Usually, the sound comes from like dynamite. It's exactly the same as a sonogram. It's exactly the same technology. We just use louder sounds, and you can see beautiful examples of river valleys in the seismic that have tributaries and point bars and everything you'd ever want to see in a river valley. And what's key is the river valleys are filled with terrestrial fossils, and outside the river valleys are commonly marine beds with marine fossils. So there's a separation. I mean, it's not just how would a flood do that? How would a flood separate in the incisions, only get plant fossils and no marine and terrestrial animals and no marine fossils? And the paleosols. Don't forget the paleosols. It's very common on the edges of these valleys to get soils. So all of this requires time, and the sedimentology is absolutely not consistent with deep water. With deep moving water, the sedimentology is completely different. So, and this is an area where I have a lot of expertise. I mean, it does not look like what you'd expect from a flood. And what's really amazing is no one can come up with a sedimentologic criteria that separates the flood deposits from everything else. You can't, the creationists can't even agree on what the bottom and the top of the flood is. I mean, that's how obscure it is. And when we look at the sedimentology of, say, sandstone, it almost always looks identical to the sedimentology we find in modern environments. It's hard to find a difference. Now, there are things that are different in the past sometimes, but the vast majority of what we see in the past looks identical to what you see deposited today in every respect, except, you don't get mammals back in the Permian, but you get river valleys for sure.
Okay, well, thank you for sharing. And I'm going to take the angiosperm problem, angiosperm pollen as the problem that you suggested for this week, because you said a lot. Okay, so
I did.
I'm not going to look up all of that this week and try to parse it out. But I want to give Jackson a chance to share his evidence. And then I hope you guys will stick around for me to share my evidence that I'm bringing against evolution today. And okay. I would love to hear your response. So Jackson, go ahead.
All right. Well, mine's pretty simple. And I may have said a little bit of this last week. I don't think I did. But I brought this up before in other places. But it's basically, why are shark teeth not found in Precambrian strata? Because creationists consider the Precambrian to be the pre-flood world. Now, between the fall, so to speak, and Noah's flood, hundreds and hundreds of years, sharks would probably be living much as they did today in that ocean. So they'd be shedding thousands of teeth per shark in their life. So millions, billions of teeth. So you should be finding a lot of teeth in the flood model in Precambrian strata. But not only do you not find shark teeth, you don't find any kind of teeth of anything in the Precambrian, Ediacaran, or anything, or even Cambrian. Or you find some conodont elements in the Cambrian, but never shark teeth or anything like that. But the Precambrian should be littered with them, and it's just not.
You might want to explain what conodonts are.
Well, conodonts, they were these like little eel-like creatures, and they had these kind of like needly looking teeth. They had a huge variety of teeth. They're like 1,500 teeth.
Phosphatic.
Right. They're not exactly teeth, but elements. And they form, unexpected layers throughout Paleozoic and into the Triassic, which you wouldn't expect in a flood either. That's not really my argument, but they do. They're like biozones. You can identify what layer is what based on what conodont is in it. But shark teeth, I think they're a major problem, because there's not one of them in the Precambrian, and they've been looking in the Precambrian for a very long time.
Or any kind of teeth. There's no teeth in the Precambrian, and teeth are nearly indestructible. They're very, very hard.
Okay, that's interesting, guys. Okay, I will look into that. And I mean, off the top of my head, that does sound a little strange, because I don't know. I mean, as thinking of this in a flood model, I would think that the flood, like the sediments that buried the Ediacaran that was probably the ocean floor, right? So you would think shark teeth and things would fall down, and so we would find them there. Do you know how many places we've looked in that layer?
Worldwide.
A lot.
If anybody found a tooth in the Precambrian, they'd be an instant superstar in geology because it would overturn so much that, we'd know about it. And they're very easy to spot. It's not like
Okay.
they're tough to spot.
All right, y'all. Okay. Are you setting the what now? If a tooth was found in the Precambrian, would that be evidence against evolution for you?
Yes. But it would have to be verifiable. You'd have to be able to take people there and show them, and it'd have to be more than just one tooth that somebody says they got there to, eliminate the possibility of fraud or lying. But yeah, and if it's Precambrian and they find teeth, there's kind of two types of out of place fossils. There are fossils that are younger than what's expected, like the coelacanth, and that doesn't present a problem for evolution. It just means something we thought was extinct isn't. But if you have animals that come before their ancestors evolved, or their ancestors evolved, that's a major problem. And it can't just be a little bit before, because you might just have the order. But, like somebody, I forget who said this, but somebody said, the way to disprove evolution is to find a Precambrian rabbit. And I think a tooth fits the bill as well.
Yeah.
Now, there are some reports of out-of-place fossils that come too early, but there's always problems with them. There's always pieces of information that are missing, like the exact location. They're not verifiable. Like objects in coal. Like if you found a bell embedded in coal, like Pennsylvania coal, that would be a huge problem for evolution. Now, there's a claim.
You found a what? Oh, the bell.
I'm saying bell.
That's really weird that you suggested the bell, because I've seen that thing about the bell. Okay, go on.
Yes, that's why I'm mentioning the bell, because there's a claim that there was a bell found in a block of coal, but they don't have the block of coal. All they have is the bell. And so that's not good enough. If you had the bell still embedded in the block of coal, that would be a big problem. And, all of the out of place fossils that come too early, they're always missing the key information you need, the key bit of evidence you need to be convinced, always. So, so a Precambrian tooth would fit the bill. That would be a huge problem.
All right. Well, I'm going to start praying that the Lord reveals a Precambrian tooth. But in the meantime, I want to share my evidence against evolution, guys. And so, when we're talking about the fossil record, for me, and Howard, I know a lot of what you're doing is you're coming against the young Earth view. Okay. And so I understand that for you, there's a lot of evidence against young Earth. And you know what? I don't care if anyone ever accepts the young Earth. Okay. And maybe there's evidence there. I would say there's more evidence against young Earth, but then there is there's evidence for and against, but you're presenting good evidence against young Earth. Okay. But now I think when it comes to evolution, there's actually very little evidence for evolution. Like you have to scrape the bottom of the barrel to get evidence for evolution. And the evidence against it is so overwhelming. And I'm just going to give you one piece of evidence against it. Okay. And here it is. Topoisomerase. Okay. Now, this is one of numerous chicken and egg problems for evolution. Why? Because every bit of life that we know, every type of life needs topoisomerase to exist. Okay. Without topoisomerase, cells die. Topoisomerase cuts as the DNA is being transcribed. The DNA gets twisted up. And if topoisomerase, what it does is it swoops in and it cuts the DNA, untwists it, and splices it back together. Now, if that doesn't happen, the cell dies. So where did topoisomerase come from? Because topoisomerase is coded for in the DNA. So you have to have DNA to get a topoisomerase. You have to be able to get DNA transcribed to build a topoisomerase. But if you don't already have a topoisomerase, then you can't get topoisomerase from the DNA because the cell will die. So you have to have it, but you have to have topoisomerase to be able to build a topoisomerase. So it's one of the numerous chicken and egg problems for evolution. Now, and there's multiple problems with topoisomerase. This particular topoisomerase is 1,531 amino acids strung together. Okay, so how does this come together by natural processes, right? This is extremely unlikely that this would come together by natural processes. And maybe Howard's looking this up right now. I don't know, but okay, good. But the other problem with topoisomerase is that there's not just one topoisomerase. There's many forms of it, and they're so different that they say these had to evolve more than once. Like this is not. They don't have a common. There's no common ancestor for several of these topoisomerases. So you have to have it for all of life. And, as far, as we know, like there's no way for this to come about by natural processes. You have to have it to get it. And so how would you respond to that?
Well, let me finish reading, sorry.
Okay.
Well, I'm not a biochemist, and I don't read a lot in that area, so I don't know. But I would suspect there are iterations of simpler forms that can do a similar function.
Yeah, so that one of the things I find as a pretty deep flaw in this line of thinking is, they say scientists can't explain X, whatever X is. Like here's an example of X. And I would say, no, scientists have not yet explained it. That doesn't mean there isn't an explanation. Just because you can't come up with an explanation doesn't mean one doesn't exist. For every scientific discovery, there was a period of thousands of years before that discovery was made when nobody could figure it out. A good example of that is, say, the orbit of the planets. The Greeks and the ancient Egyptians, 3,000 years ago, had enough information to figure out gravity and the orbit of the planets, but it took Newton to really figure that out. So you could say for 3,000 years, gee, the gods must be moving the planets because there's no scientific explanation. What could possibly be doing it? So just because we don't know the origin of something doesn't mean it doesn't have a scientific origin. By scientific I mean non-supernatural. I think what Jackson said is reasonable, that there could have been a much simpler form. So the early forms of life, for example, could have had much shorter chains of DNA that didn't require this molecule. And as the DNA got longer, as the cell mechanics became more complicated, that this device would have evolved in gradual steps. Just because we don't know what the steps are doesn't mean they don't exist.
Well, that's true, but aren't we talking about our scientific observations? Like, shouldn't we follow what we know and observe to be true now, which is we do not observe proteins being built like by coming together by natural processes, right? Like they have to be coded in the DNA. There's only one process that we know of that can build a protein. So like, it's not about what we don't know, it's about what we do know. So what we do know is that this is the problem. So like what I mean is we have to have some way, if evolution is a scientific theory, then we have to be able to say at some point, this is not true and here's why. But I have a feeling, because the way that you're talking, it sounds like it's more of a religious belief. So it's like something you're going to believe no matter what, even if the science is currently against it, you're going to keep believing it and hope that we find a discovery one day.
No, this is basically irreducible complexity, which has been used as an argument against evolution since the 1830s, I think, is when it was first described for the eye as irreducibly complex. And it's all irreducible complexity says is that somebody can't imagine how it could have happened. But that's not evidence it didn't happen. Now, we certainly observe things today, but, we don't know what the earliest life looked like. There's no fossil record of that. Proteins and DNA doesn't get preserved from the Precambrian when this biology would have evolved, if it did evolve. So you can't use our lack of knowledge as evidence against something happening. And so you can't, I think there could potentially be some series of steps that would lead to this. But once you get to that point, then you don't see those earlier steps anymore. And although, we don't see this for proteins because they just don't get preserved, with very, very few exceptions. We do see it for hard parts all the time, increasing complexity where you can see all the steps. So, this is a lack of knowledge. It's a God of the gaps, and it's our lack of understanding of how this protein came about or how the other proteins like hemoglobin came about isn't evidence they didn't come about. It's just evidence we don't know. But nobody's claiming we have all the answers. I mean, if we had all the answers, we'd stop. We'd be done. And so there's a lot we don't know about how specific things happen, but I think the fossil record does have many, many examples of transitional forms that are very hard to explain with the creationist model.
Well, I disagree with that. But again, I think, what's happening here is that, the theory of evolution is being promoted as if it is matching with our scientific observations. And no matter how many things seem to contradict it, it's still embraced as, well, we'll figure out the answer someday. But, and that's fine for a religious belief, but it doesn't sound like what we should be doing with science.
I don't agree that that's happening at all. We had, there was no mechanism for understanding how genetic plans were transmitted until Crichton and Watt discovered DNA. And so, you could have said before then, well, evolution is impossible because there's no mechanism by which you could encode all the directions to create a complex cell inside a complex cell. So which came first, but then they discovered DNA. And so that provided the mechanism by which all that information could be encoded. And there's a lot we don't know, but, there's two things that I take home. One is that the stratigraphic record has plenty of time, so time is not an issue. And the second is there is an order to the fossil record, and there is many, many examples of transitional species that would not occur if evolution was not true. So, and biostratigraphy wouldn't, I don't know how that would work. I'll just give you one quick example. In petroleum geology, we use a fossil called a coccolith a lot for biostratigraphy. It's a microscopic algae, and the succession of microscopic species is used as biostratigraphic indicators, say in the Gulf Coast and in Africa. And what you can find is that these microscopic algae occur in exactly the same order in wells that are 1,000 miles apart. And yet with all the violent mixing of the flood, how could that happen without time? And the better explanation is that different species evolved and they spread through currents worldwide, or at least in the Atlantic, and that provided the order. I think there's no creationist explanation that will get them in the right order, certainly not sedimentologic. There's no sorting mechanism that will do it. And then, for the transition from, say, therapsids to mammals, that is so good that there are fossils we're not even sure which side of the dividing line they're on. So, and how would that work?
Well, Howard, what if I just say, well, we don't know, but we'll figure it out one day? Because that's you're doing with topoisomerase, right?
No, because there is, I mean, we do understand the mechanisms of deposition. There's no lack of understanding there. There's no observation that we can't make. So these are, fairly solvable problems. So it's very unlike that. We know this how the sedimentology works, and the transitional forms. It's exactly what's predicted. Now we don't. There's a lot of animal types that appear suddenly where we don't have the transitions, but there's a lot that we do at the transitions for.
Well, see, I think topoisomerase is a good indicator that there is a designer, a creator, because topoisomerase not only has to be built, it also has to know what it's supposed to do. How did it know? How did it know that it had this scissor mechanism? How did it know that DNA needed to be cut? How did it know? Why does it care? Why does this little protein machine care about getting the DNA cut? Why does it know? How did it both get the ability to do it and the know-how?
Well, that's exactly the same question as how did the eye evolve? How did the lens know?
Good question. All of that is still a good question.
Yeah, but we have. I mean, Darwin. You should read Darwin's explanation of the evolution of the eye. It's really elegant and it holds up today. So every stage that you need to develop an eye, from just a few cells that are light sensitive all the way to a complex eye, is living today. So there's no problem with having half an eye and having it work, because there's animals that have half an eye and have it work.
Well, that can be excused in Darwin's day because they didn't know that much, but today we know a lot more. And you mentioned DNA, which, just the observation of the way that we have DNA, you mentioned that, observation, which is great. It's profound. It's a profound discovery, but it doesn't help evolution. It actually it's worse. It's harder for evolution because we know this is all of our scientific observations. We know that codes do not come about except by intelligence. If you find a code, you know that a human has been involved, right? And so we found a code. We found not only any code, DNA is actually the most fantastic code that we've ever discovered. So basically, we know from all of our scientific observations that codes don't come about by natural processes. But yet we find the most fantastic code and we're going to say that came about by natural processes. That's not a scientific belief.
The reasoning you're using is called inductive, and it was rejected by scientists about 400 years ago, and it's still rejected today. You could say, yes, we've never observed an asteroid hit the Earth, therefore it has never happened, and yet we have evidence that it happened in the past. There's lots of things that we can't observe today. What is the
evidence that it happened in the past? What is the evidence that it happened in the past?
That what happened in the past?
Well, that DNA came together, a code could come together in the past.
Well, we don't know. We don't know how that happened, but that's not to say it didn't happen. That's just God of the gaps. We don't know. And just saying, you could have said 200 years ago, you could have said, no human has ever flown, only birds fly, bats fly, insects fly, no human has ever flown, therefore no human could ever fly. That's the exact same reasoning you're using, and yet we discovered how to make airplanes, and now humans can fly. And so there's always the possibility that somebody's going to discover a way that this code could have evolved through time, even though we don't know it today.
If we discover that, then it would be scientific to believe it. But right now, until we discover that a code can come about by natural processes, the scientific belief, the one that matches our observations of the world, is that codes don't come about unless an intelligence intervenes.
You only have one example of a code that we don't know, and so that's DNA. And so, it's again inductive reasoning, which was rejected by science 400 years ago by I forget whom now. But that's not the way science works. Science works with testable hypotheses. And, we can't test a hypothesis on the origin of DNA because there's no way to go back and do that. Maybe someday somebody will develop a testable hypothesis. The origin of life problem has been stumped. There was a huge amount of progress in the 50s and 60s with creating amino acids and nucleic acids with non-biological systems, purely physically trying to simulate the early atmosphere and such. And it's kind of stalled since then. But that's not to say it won't continue to be. Someday somebody might make a discovery. But what we do have is the fossil evidence, which is just so overwhelming that evolution happened. So I think, there are lots of gaps and things we don't understand, but there's lots of positive evidence that we do have. And there's been, I'll just stop there.
Well, Howard, I'm going to still disagree with you that we can't test whether a code can come about by natural processes. We can test that. And, let's get a bunch of ones and zeros and just, let them sort themselves randomly and see if it ever produces a code.
Sure. So, all you have to do is wait 1 billion years and we'll see, and then we'll know.
Okay. And I'm sure with the supercomputers that we have, we could run a simulation like that, right?
No, it won't.
The point
because
is
you have to have natural selection to have that happen.
Okay. Well, the point is that right now, like we do observe codes. We know that every code has a source it has an intelligent source. Okay. That's our observation.
I would state it differently. I think you could break down that statement to say every code written by human was written by an intelligent human. And that's a tautology. It doesn't prove anything. And you don't have any other example.
If you came upon a code, would you think it came about by natural processes?
Yes. DNA is a great example.
Well, see, that's circular reasoning, right?
No, it's not.
That
it's just showing there's a gap in our knowledge. But, this gets back to the finding a watch in the forest and whether that could have come about by natural processes. It's the exact same argument. And that was, dealt with, 150 years ago or so. The reason we know codes are written by humans is because they're human codes. We know what a human code looks like. It's just, the complexity is irrelevant. It's just knowing that was written by a human. And so all the examples you have are codes written by humans. And so it is a tautology to say all codes written by humans are written by humans. And you don't have any other example other than codes written by humans where you can prove it was written by an intelligent. So it's a circular reasoning. It's a tautology. It doesn't help us understand natural systems.
Okay, so are you saying that right now your belief is that a code that is better than any code that humans have ever written was able to come about by these natural processes?
I think it's very likely based on all the other evidence we have, the surrounding evidence for the ancient age of the Earth and the surrounding evidence for the succession of fossils. Yeah, I think that's the evidence that convinces me that it happened. The origin of life question is a bit different, and I can't. There's no explanation for that right now, but we have so much other evidence that evolution happened that it's so overwhelming. I just don't see how you can get around it. And what really convinces me that this is the right approach is I've read lots of creationist books and I've watched hundreds of creationist videos. And whenever they talk about a topic I know, they don't tell the truth. The evidence is misrepresented to the point where it's outright false. And if this was really true, then that wouldn't happen. And I see it over and over again. There's this video series, Standing for the Truth. Every time they have somebody
still messing up.
Every time they have somebody on that show talking about geology, they make basic, just fundamental errors. And so if it was really true, they would have the truth on their side. And yet it isn't.
Okay, well, I feel the same way about evidence that's presented for evolution. So I may not be an expert, but I have a good BS meter And so,
what outside of proteins, because I know nothing about proteins.
I'm
So
sorry, guys.
outside
My
of-
internet is still missing.
oh, that's okay.
So outside of proteins, what have you seen that's BS?
Well, like, I mean, first of all, there's no evolutionary mechanism, okay, that can produce the diversity of life that we see today. So there's a lot of evolutionary mechanisms proposed. But if you look at each one of them, like, okay, they'll say horizontal gene transfer. Okay, that's moving genes around. But where do you get those genes? You have to have genes in order to move genes around. Genes are thousands of chemicals, right? Base pairs working together in coordination and sometimes working with multiple genes in coordination. So that ends up being millions of chemicals working together in coordination. So, okay, so you don't have a mechanism. So all the mechanisms like genetic drift and all these different things that are suggested are all moving genes around. The only one that is actually a potential gene creator is mutation, right? Mutation plus natural selection. But the problem is mutation, generally speaking, is not a good thing for organisms, and we know that. Now, I admit there can be neutral mutations, and there might be a one-off where you could, change one base pair and get some kind of possible benefit for a creature. But that's a far cry from being able to build organs, to build systems, to even in your eye, you've got how many genes working together to make your eye work. That's what you have to build. And mutation plus natural selection has not shown, not even close, not even the least, to be able to do that.
Well, there are computer simulations. You talked about computer simulations. There are absolutely computer simulations that show increasing complexity with time. If you have enough time, you can do this. And so you're right, the vast majority of mutations are not beneficial, but some are, and you just need a small percentage that are over billions of years to build this mechanism. You need the billions of years, though.
Well, and it seems to me that timeline moves back all the time.
What do you mean?
Like the amount of time we need seems to move back and back. And
well, I don't know. I mean, I just said billions. It could be hundreds of millions. I don't know.
Okay. But now they're getting back to basically saying that, the Earth is 4.5 billion years old, and, now life started 4.2 billion years old. 4.2 billion years ago. And that has slowly moved. And I think it's because we keep finding out we need more time. We need more time. We need more time.
No, it's based on the fossils. It's based on the fossils. So the stratigraphy provides, and this is my main expertise. And so I don't like talking about genetics and proteins, not because it's a difficult topic for evolution, but because it's a difficult topic for me because I have no training in that. I mean, I took a genetics course in 1981, I think. So that's the last time I took a genetics course. But, I know stratigraphy very well. I know geology very well. And, the young Earth fails dramatically for many different reasons. And, all you have to do is know enough about geology to see all the lies in the books that are published about this, including the book that you first came to my attention when you read. You were quoting from this book. I forget the name of it now, but I read that book, and it was just filled with lies. I don't know how a geologist could say that with a straight face. It was with lies.
And I think that, and I can't remember the exact name of the title either, but it's by Monte Fleming. It's something about Earth's history. Yeah. But let's keep in mind, and I hope people watching will keep this in mind too, that yes, Howard is someone who has expertise in this area, but so is the person who wrote that book. He also has a PhD in geology and years of experience. So he wrote a book and it talked about all of the evidence for a young Earth from geology. So I thought it was a great book. And
but you don't know anything, and I'm not insulting your intelligence.
Yes, I
I'm saying
understand.
you don't know anything about geology, and it's not that it has nothing to do with my expertise. That's irrelevant. His expertise is irrelevant. What is relevant is he says, for example, in that book, that if the Earth was really old and deposition was really slow, there'd be lots of bioturbation, and there isn't. And that's a lie. There's lots and lots of bioturbation. He said if the Earth was old and we had all these sediment layers deposited on land, there'd be lots of insect burrows, and there aren't. Another lie. There are lots and lots of insect burrows in the rock record. So there is, it's not my expertise that is the issue here, is the evidence is against many of the things he said. It's, you can go to the outcrop and see the evidence that falsifies his statements.
Okay, but as far as I remember it, I do think you're slightly misrepresenting, not intentionally, but he does talk about bioturbation in layers. So he's not saying there's no bioturbation. He's just saying
he said there was
more.
He said that if the Earth was old, you'd see lots of layers with insect burrows, and you don't, and you do. You know that.
Well, let's actually make sure that that's what it says, because I the way that I remember it is he actually talks about bioturbation, what it is. He talks about that we do see bioturbation, but he says, but we would see it in all of these layers that are supposed to be separated by millions of years, but there's no bioturbation. And I've seen with my own eyes what he's talking about in the layers here in Utah, where it's like one layer on top of another. There's nothing in between them. There's nothing but a straight line going
and
across.
You've walked up and put your finger on the outcrop so you can say that there's no soil there.
Well, what do you mean? Like, do I have to go to a specific location? I mean,
no, just any location. Any location.
I've been hiking and like touched the rock, like on the trail.
But you need to learn what bioturbation looks like, what soils look like, in order to recognize them. It's not just you can't just walk up to an outcrop and say, oh, it takes some practice, it takes some expertise. And as I said, there are many layers that have no erosion between them, but there are many layers that do have erosion between them. So it just depends on where you are and what the specific conditions are during the time of deposition. So, and without knowing what formations you're looking at, if you told me the name of the formation, I could probably give you a more precise answer for what you were specifically looking at. But certainly there are lots of places where you can go and see exactly what you're saying you don't see. It's just that you have to kind of know what you're looking for. But there are statements in Fleming's book that are flat out false, just false.
I have something to add to that. Sorry to come in and out like that. My internet's been messing up. So I've got my camera off. It seems to be fixing it. So, about what insect.
Let me get Fleming's book. I'll be right back.
About insect burrows, like not being common. They're the most common fossil I find here in Arkansas on the Carboniferous strata, or not necessarily insects, but invertebrates. There's one fossil I would show you, but I'm afraid if I show the camera, it'll mess up my internet connection. But it's called Scolithos. And I find dozens of these. They're these, looks like a sponge almost. These are worm burrows. You see the cross section that goes all the way through. And trace fossils are probably, if not the most common fossil there is. So that's definitely not true.
Well, again, I'm arguing with what Howard said, because he says Monty Fleming says there's no bioturbation, and that's not what he says. He says there are places with bioturbation. It's just, if there's we do find layers, lots of them, that have no bioturbation in between the layers, and that's not what we would expect if these layers represent millions of years. So Howard went to go get the book so he can prove me wrong. So I look forward to hearing that. I went and got my copy too, Howard. So let's see what you find. But did you have something else you wanted to say while we're looking for this, Jackson?
Just trace fossils are incredibly common. I mean, they're everywhere. So if that is in fact his argument, that's not true.
it's not a matter of like not, it's not a matter of not, he's not saying there's no trace fossils. So anyway, guys, thank you so much for the people in the chat who are all making comments here, and I'll put a couple of comments up. So, and I'll just kind of go backwards. So these are the most recent ones. Hillary's email says caustic action, bad conditions for fossilization, too much O2 in the air. I actually don't know what he's responding to. Pierre had a question for Howard. He said, why do we find tetrapods only as trackways during the 40 million year period before any tetrapod fossils and before the supposed transitionals?
I don't know the answer to that. What I guess, is he talking about in the Devonian? Maybe he could say specifically what he's talking about.
Okay. So Pierre, if you're still there, please give us a specific. Captive Desk says because the layers are severely compressed under a microscope is different. And Hillary's email says, wouldn't a global flood result in masturbation? Honestly, I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know if she's making a joke or something, but.
Oh, Hillary's email is a guy. It's just, a joke about Hillary Clinton. So, Dave the Brahmin says people reject evolution because they can't accept the implications. I reject it because it goes against our scientific observations. That's why I reject it.
Well, I think the implication of evolution doesn't mean there isn't a God. I mean, I personally don't think there is one, but there are plenty of people who accept evolution and believe in God,
Yeah, I agree. And actually, if somebody tells me they believe in evolution and they believe in God, and basically God used evolution, okay, there's nothing I can say to that because they have a miracle worker. Evolution needs miracles. So if you have a miracle worker, then you can have evolution. But I just don't think that's the way God did it.
Yeah, he says, he said, here's an example. He says, while we find a little erosion between some of the layers, we find no evidence that erosion routinely carried away the majority of sediment of the deposited material. Instead, we see evidence for only one layer deposited after another in quick succession. That's not true, because that ignores all the river valleys that are in, I'm reading on page 50, and it ignores all the paleosols, it ignores all the bioturbation.
Well, he acknowledges some of that, and he gives.
He does acknowledge some of it. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean,
but he downplays the amount of bioturbation. He says most rock layers contain no bioturbation. I don't think that's true. I don't know anybody that's compiled the evidence, but my experience is the vast majority of rock layers contain abundant bioturbation. So you're right, I did misstate it, and I apologize for that.
Okay, well, thank you for backtracking on that. Okay, well, is there anywhere else that you guys wanted to go in this conversation?
Well, are there any other comments you can show? I'd like to respond to comments if they're there.
Oh, sure.
If there's anything interesting.
I had a question for you earlier. Let me go find it. So, wait, no, not that. I have to look for it. People have been really chatty today. Thank you, everyone. So Pierre asked, you said we will somehow discover a naturalistic gradual way to build, that's
the protein you were talking about.
Topoi.
I didn't quite say that. I said we might discover a natural way to do it.
So until we do discover a natural way to do it, what is the most scientific belief?
Well, I don't even like the word believe, because it suggests a religious faith. And when it comes to science and the evidence for evolution, I reject religious faith as a mechanism to better understand what's going on. I accept the ancient age for the earth because I see the evidence every day when I go for a hike in my backyard, outside my backyard. I accept the fossil record for what it is, that there is an increase, there is a succession of fossils. You see the succession invasion of land. I don't think there's a creationist explanation for the order of the fossil record. And there are lots of transitional forms. And so this is enough to convince me. I don't understand genetics. I don't understand proteins. I know nothing about proteins. So it's very hard for me to answer that question. But the complexity, the irreducible complexity question has been answered a long time ago.
And to add to that, there are plenty of things, at least in my mind, that if they were found would disprove evolution.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the hallmark of not a religious belief.
Wait, what are the things that you say prove evolution?
No, it's something that were found, like shark teeth in the Precambrian. Or if you could somehow, for example, prove that our closest genetic relative wasn't a chimpanzee or something like a tree or something that just didn't make any sense at all, that would be evidence to me that evolution might not actually be real.
Yeah, it's a complete lack of modern, any kind of living organism as a fossil in the Precambrian and the pre-flood world. There's nothing that's even remotely modern. All you have is the Ediacara fauna, which is not modern in any way, despite what you said about the sea pens. That's they look superficially like sea pens, but they're not. And stromatolites, which are still around today, I guess. But that's it.
Okay, Pierre wrote in his specifics. Okay, so I will go ahead and put that up, even though I kind of want to respond to what you were saying about the chimpanzee, because I think we can show that there's a problem with this idea that the chimpanzee is our closest ancestor. Let me just go ahead and
closest relative.
Okay, yeah, closest, yeah, okay. So basically, one of the problems with it is that, do you realize that even though pigs are on a different branch of the evolutionary tree, and we're on the branch with the great apes and these things, right? But we share a lot of genes with pigs.
Sure.
That chimpanzees and those in the ape line do not have. So, there's actually some evolutionists that believe that what would have had to happen is that a chimp and a pig mated, and that's how we got us. Okay. Now, that is, as far as we know, impossible. But I mean, that's the hypothesis. But how would you explain, why do we have so many pig genes? Why do we share when they're on a different line?
I just don't know anything about genetics, so it's very difficult for me to answer that question without doing a lot of research, which frankly I'm not going to do because I have enough things to occupy my time.
Right. Well, I'm just saying there's problems with the story. There's lots of problems with the story. Okay. So if you are willing to look into it, you'll find the problems with the story. But if you're not, that's okay.
Well, it's not, it's a time element. I'm currently editing 2 books on stratigraphy, and I'm consulting as a petroleum geologist, and I'm writing another book. So that's frankly where I put my time. And when I'm not doing those things, I spend time with my family.
I totally understand. And, a lot of people are in that position. Not you're in science, but I mean, a lot of people just believe in evolution by default because they don't want to take the time to study it. And they just figure the best bet is just to trust the experts. And, right now in academia, there's a huge, basically, stronghold of evolution. So it just
for good reason.
Well, I disagree. I think it's for bad reason. Okay.
Well, it didn't used to be that way a couple hundred years ago, but then the evidence showed that evolution was the best explanation, and then suddenly all the experts started thinking that it was.
Well, I disagree with that. I think that we have actually now falsified evolution many times over, but the belief in evolution is so strong that it doesn't matter how much evidence we have against it, people are going to keep believing it. And that's what I found, is that the best evidence for evolution is actually the numbers of people who believe it. And so right now, that's, I think, where its strength lies. Now, Pierre put these, are you reading Pierre's comments, Howard?
I can't see them.
Okay, I'm going to put them up now. He said the earliest fossils of limb tetrapods, the trackways, from Zaktmi in Poland, Aphelion.
Iphelion.
Okay, why don't you read it?
The earliest fossils of limb tetrapods, the trackways from the Zaktmi in Poland, Iphelion, which is in the Devonian, I believe, and Valentia Island, Ireland, Gavetian. I think that's also, let me check my cheat sheet here.
Devonian.
And I think that's also in the Devonian.
Yeah, it is.
Are respectively about 390 and 385 million years old.
The comment continues, and thus compatible with, about 390, and thus compatible with this new inferred timeline. However, the widely accepted picture of Devonian tetrapods as the low diversity array of primitive fish-like forms must be false. And the result strongly supports the much earlier origin of limb tetrapods indicated by the Middle Devonian trackway record, and implies that tetrapods underwent a far faster process of cladogenesis.
Yeah, I'm only vaguely familiar with the origin of tetrapods. I know there's a lot of work in the Arctic, in the Devonian on that. I'm not that familiar with these trackways, so it's hard for me to respond. But some fossil has to be the first for every group, and sometimes the origin is pushed back a little bit, but I don't think that invalidates evolution. But I have to say I'm not that familiar with these trackways. I'll try to look the track. That stuff I can look up pretty easily. So
I've actually talked to the scientist who worked on those trackways, and he's basically saying it's not really a huge problem because tetrapodomorphs, the fish, originate a couple tens of millions of years before that, at least, that we know of, and probably a little before that even.
Okay, wait a minute, guys. But just 2 weeks ago, okay, an article came out that put the tetrapod evolution back for 40 million years. Okay, because we found clawed trackways in Australia that
from the early Carboniferous.
Right. So now they're saying, now they either have to move the entire timeline back, or fish have to evolve super fast.
Well, that's the guy I was talking to. Per Alberg is his name. He was working on that paper. I emailed him about that to clarify some things, and he's basically saying it's not really a huge issue. It just means that some of the tetrapodomorphs of the late Devonian are kind of relics of another line, and the there are some tetrapodomorphs like lobe-finned fish that originate a couple tens, in the early Silurian period. Early Devonian period. These tracks are in the early Carboniferous. It just means that limbed tetrapods are a little bit sooner than we thought, but it's not like they found them in the Silurian, which is totally behind all the tetrapodomorphs. That would be a real issue.
Wait, what would be a real issue?
If they found those tracks in the Silurian period instead of the early Carboniferous,
okay,
and in between that's the Devonian, where all the other ones have been found. So this is still found ahead of those. But so if you found that instead in the late Silurian, not the late Carboniferous, then it would be a huge issue.
Yeah, but it is still an issue because they say that, there has to be, according to their, molecular dating from the genetics, they say there has to be at least 33 million years in between, the stem tetrapods and the amniotes, which is what the tracks were from, right? So it is a problem.
Well, the molecular clock is still roughly in line with the fossils, even with this discovery.
Okay. Well, you've got to move you've got to get the transition somewhere, right? So if it's fine if they're 40 million years earlier, but what about the fish? Those poor fish, how fast do they have to evolve now?
Well, the fish started evolving in the Cambrian with the little those tadpoles I talked about last week, and then the ostracoderms and the Ordovician, then the more jawed fish in the Silurian, and so that's still a well-known line, and that hasn't been undone by this. Well, it's not really a line; it's a tree, but you get what I mean.
Okay. Yep. Okay. Do you guys have any closing thoughts? I think we've had a great discussion today. I appreciate you guys.
I'm good. I'm going to have dinner.
Yeah, well, thank you for being here, guys. And I really do love it that we had knowledgeable people come on today and share their expertise. So thank you, guys.
You're going to look up angiosperms in the Paleozoic.
Yes.
Well, like I say, there's a few questionable occurrences, but nobody's ever been able to replicate them. So
Okay.
Probably the best argument there is, really.
Yeah.
Okay. And then you have and then I'm going to look up the shark teeth in the Precambrian.
Yeah, I already know the answer to that. There are none.
Okay.
Yeah.
All
There's
right.
no teeth of any kind in the Precambrian. None. Not a single tooth that's ever been found. Maybe somebody will find one tomorrow, but they haven't so far.
You said you're in Utah, Rebecca?
Yeah.
There is a Cambrian formation in Utah that produces a lot of fossils. You could be the first person to find a shark tooth in the Cambrian, maybe.
Cool. Wait,
Yeah.
we have shark teeth in the Cambrian, don't we?
No, there aren't any in the Cambrian.
Okay. Well, hey, maybe I'll go out and find it. Maybe God will answer my prayer.
So is that the Flathead sandstone? Is that what you're thinking of?
I can't think of what it's called at the moment. It slipped my mind, but
I think it's
I think
it's the Flathead.
the House Range. Is that it?
Flathead sandstone, Middle Cambrian in the Rocky Mountains. It's in Wyoming and Montana, so maybe it doesn't get into Utah.
No, I know there's one in Utah. I can't.
All right,
think
I'll
of it.
look it up. I'll look it up. And you know what? If there's a Cambrian layer here, I'll go get it. I'll go dig. I'll make a video on it.
And if next time I'm in Utah looking at incised valleys, I'll let you know.
Cool. Awesome. Do you come here a lot?
Yes.
Oh, wow. So this could actually happen like this summer?
I've already been there once this year. Last year I went there a lot. It just depends on my schedule and what I've got going. So I've led field trips there for professionals, and I ran a conference in Green River, Utah. So I've been to Utah hundreds of times. Yeah.
Very cool.
All right, I got to go.
Take care. Thanks everybody for being here, and have a
Thanks,
good night.